I spent hours cooking for him, thinking about every detail, making sure everything was just right, and when he finally took a bite, he looked at me and said, "Yeah, I don't really eat tofu." That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. Nick and I had been together for 3 years. We met when I was fresh out of college, still figuring things out while he was already settled in his job, confident, charming. In the beginning, he made me feel special, like I was the only person in the world who truly mattered to him. He had this way of making even the most ordinary moments seem exciting. Late-night drives, takeout dinners, sitting on the floor of my first tiny apartment watching movies. It all felt like a dream, but over time, things started to shift. At first it was small, a dismissive comment about my hobbies, a joke about my taste in movies, a subtle eye roll when I got excited about something. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. He was just teasing, right? That's what couples do. But the thing about small things is that they add up, and one night, standing in my kitchen, holding a bowl of food I had carefully prepared, I finally saw it for what it was. I had been planning this meal for days. Mapo tofu, one of my favorite dishes. I had grown up eating it, watching my mom make it from scratch, the smell of Sichuan peppercorns filling our kitchen. Cooking had always been a way for me to connect with my roots, with my family, with myself. I was excited to share that with him. I told him about it earlier in the day, and he had nodded, barely paying attention. "Sounds good," he had said, scrolling through his phone. But when I finally placed the food in front of him, his reaction was immediate. He barely looked at it before making a face. "Taco Bell sounds nice right now," he muttered, half laughing as if it was some kind of joke. I forced a smile. "Just try it," I said, hoping, stupidly, that he'd at least give it a chance. He sighed, scooped up a small bite, and chewed for maybe half a second before shaking his head. "Yeah, I don't really eat tofu." I stared at him, not sure if I had heard him right. "You've never said that before," I said, trying to keep my voice even. He shrugged. "I guess I never had a reason to." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. He had a reason now. I was his reason, and he didn't care. I pushed the bowl aside, my appetite gone. "You don't have to eat it," I said, suddenly exhausted. "You can order whatever you want." "Great, I will," he said, standing up, already reaching for his phone. I sat there watching him, and for the first time in our relationship, I didn't feel like his girlfriend. I felt like a stranger, sitting across from someone who had never really bothered to know me at all. Nick scrolled through his phone, casually placing an order like my cooking didn't even exist. I sat there, staring at the bowl in front of me, my appetite completely gone. It wasn't just about the tofu. It was the way he dismissed me so easily, like my time, my effort, my excitement meant nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to push the frustration down. "You could have just told me earlier that you don't like tofu," I said, my voice as calm as I could manage. Nick sighed, still tapping at his phone. "Maddie, I didn't know you were going to get all upset about it." I clenched my jaw. "I'm not upset that you don't like it. I'm upset that you acted like it was disgusting without even giving it a real chance." He finally looked up, his expression already irritated. I took a bite. "I didn't like it. What do you want me to do, pretend it's good?" I shook my head. "No, I want you to have a little respect. I spent time making this. I was excited to share it with you, and you acted like it was some kind of joke." Nick rolled his eyes and leaned back in his chair. "Oh my God, Maddie, it's just food. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Just food. I could feel the frustration rising in my chest, the heat creeping up my neck. This wasn't just about food, and he knew it. It was about how he never took me seriously, how he always turned things around to make me look unreasonable. Every single time I tried to express a feeling, he found a way to make me feel like I was overreacting. "You always do this," I said, my voice quieter now. "Every time I bring up something that bothers me, you act like I'm being dramatic." Nick let out a sarcastic laugh. "Because you are. You're sitting here pouting because I didn't like your food. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "You didn't just not like it. You made a face before you even tried it. You made a joke about Taco Bell. You acted like my cooking, like something important to me, was worthless." He threw his hands up. "Jesus, Maddie, I didn't think it was that serious. You're acting like I insulted your entire existence." I stared at him, feeling something inside me crack. Maybe he didn't say the words outright, but that's exactly what it felt like. Every eye roll, every dismissive comment, every time he made me feel small without even trying. It all piled up until I didn't even recognize myself in this relationship anymore. I used to be confident. I used to stand up for myself. And now I was sitting here, fighting for basic decency from the person who was supposed to love me. Nick's phone buzzed, and he glanced down at it, already moving on. "Food's on the way," he said, like that settled the argument. I let out a hollow laugh. "Of course it is." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up, pushing my chair back. "Nothing." I grabbed my bowl and walked to the sink, dumping the food out with a sharp clatter. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want any of this. Behind me, Nick sighed loudly. "Oh, come on now, you're being passive-aggressive." I turned to face him. "No, Nick, I'm just tired." His eyebrows furrowed, and for a second, he actually looked concerned. "Tired of what?" I exhaled slowly, a feeling like nothing I do is ever good enough for you. Nick scoffed. "Maddie, that's in your head. I never said that." I shook my head. "You don't have to say it, you show it, all the time." For the first time in the conversation, he didn't have an immediate response. He just stared at me like he couldn't believe I was actually calling him out. But before he could open his mouth, his phone buzzed again. He looked down, saw the notification, and smirked. "Food's here," he said, standing up like nothing had happened. I watched him walk to the door, my stomach twisting. He wasn't going to apologize. He wasn't even going to acknowledge what I had just said. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the tofu, not the argument, but the fact that he truly didn't care. Nick sat on the couch, unwrapping his fast food like nothing had happened. The sound of crinkling wrappers and the artificial smell of melted cheese and seasoned meat filled the apartment, overpowering the rich spices I had carefully balanced in my dish. He scrolled through his phone between bites, occasionally chuckling at whatever he was reading. Every few seconds, he would take another bite, chewing loudly, completely absorbed in whatever meaningless thing had caught his attention. I stood frozen by the sink, gripping the counter, watching him like I was seeing him for the first time. 3 years. 3 years of shared memories, of inside jokes, of believing we were building something real. And yet, in this moment, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. I turned away, staring down at the empty bowl in the sink, the remnants of my ruined dinner smeared along the edges. It had taken me hours to prepare, and he had dismissed it in seconds. But it wasn't just about the food. If it were, I could have brushed it off, laughed, told him to order his damn tacos and moved on. No, this was about something bigger. It was about the way he treated me, the way he had always treated, the casual disregard, the way he could make me feel small without even trying. Or maybe he was trying, and that was the problem. I left the kitchen without saying a word. He didn't even look up. I went straight to our bedroom and closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, my heart pounding. I wasn't even sure why. I wasn't scared of Nick, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't violent, he wasn't aggressive, but he had a different kind of power. The ability to twist reality, to make me feel like I was always the one in the wrong. And somehow, I had let him. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my mind racing. The fight replayed itself over and over again in my head, but now, it wasn't just tonight's argument, it was all the little moments before this. The times he had dismissed me, made me question myself, turned every issue back on me until I felt guilty for even bringing it up. And the worst part was, I had believed him. I picked up my phone and opened my messages, scrolling until I found Sarah's name. My best friend, the one person who had never sugarcoated things for me. I hesitated for a second, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, then typed out a quick message. "Hey, you up?" The dots appeared almost immediately. "Yeah, what's up?" I stared at the screen, debating whether I should even say anything. It felt stupid, insignificant. But the feeling in my chest, the sinking, heavy feeling, told me otherwise. I took a deep breath and typed, "Nick and I got into an argument. I made dinner, and he was just awful about it." Made a face, said he didn't like it, then acted like I was crazy for being upset. I don't know, I feel stupid for even bringing it up. Her reply came so fast I barely had time to put the phone down. "You're not stupid. He's an asshole." I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. I just feel like this keeps happening. Like every time I try to tell him how I feel, he makes it seem like I'm the problem. There was a long pause before her next message. Maddie, I love you, but I don't know how else to say this. You deserve better than him. He makes you feel like shit constantly. Why are you still with him? I blinked at the screen, my stomach twisting. It wasn't like I hadn't thought about it before. There had been plenty of moments where I had questioned things, wondered if I was truly happy, if this relationship was actually good for me. But I had always pushed those thoughts aside, convinced myself that every couple had rough patches, that no relationship was perfect. But reading Sarah's words, seeing them spelled out so clearly by someone who had known me for years, made it feel different. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat there, staring at the ceiling, letting my mind wander. I thought about the times Nick had made me feel small, the times I had shared something personal with him, only for him to shrug it off like it was nothing, the times I had excitedly told him about a new book I was reading, only for him to roll his eyes and say, "Sounds boring," the times I had put effort into things, little things like planning date nights, making his favorite meals, remembering the small details about his day, only to get nothing in return. The way he never asked about my day, never really listened when I talked, the way he could go hours, even days, without showing any real affection, like I was just there. And then there were the apologies, or rather the lack of them. He never apologized, not really. If I told him he hurt my feelings, he would sigh, act like I was exhausting, make me feel like I was the one causing a problem. And somehow, every single time, I ended up being the one to say sorry. I used to be different. I used to be someone who didn't take shit from anyone. I used to be confident, sure of myself, unwilling to settle for less than what I deserved. When had that changed? When had I started making excuses for him? When had I convinced myself that this was okay? From the other room, I heard Nick laugh at something on his phone. The sound grated against my nerves, sharp and careless. I thought about going out there, trying to talk to him again, trying to explain why tonight had hurt me. But I already knew how that conversation would go. He would sigh, roll his eyes, maybe pull me onto the couch, kiss my forehead, say, "Come on, Maddie, don't be mad," like that was supposed to fix everything. Like my feelings were just a temporary inconvenience, easily smoothed over if he ignored them long enough. I looked back at Sarah's message. "Why are you still with him?" I didn't have an answer. And that terrified me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Nick talking on the phone. His voice was low, but his tone was unmistakable. Annoyed, defensive, like he was trying to explain himself to someone. I stayed in bed for a moment, listening, my stomach already twisting before I even fully processed what he was saying. "I don't know, Mom, she just blew up over nothing," he said, letting out a sharp exhale. "Yeah, because I didn't want to eat some weird tofu dish. Like, excuse me for having normal taste." I sat up slowly, my chest tightening. He was talking about me. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "I know, right? She got all worked up like I insulted her entire culture or something. It's just food. I don't get why she's always so emotional about everything." I felt frozen, my mind scrambling to catch up. He was making fun of me. I could hear the smirk in his voice, the same condescending tone he used on me when he wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting. And worst of all, he was talking to his mother, Karen, the woman who had never liked me, never really accepted me. She was polite enough in person, but there was always an underlying edge to her comments, a subtle way of making me feel like I wasn't quite good enough for her. Nick sighed dramatically. "Yeah, exactly. She just doesn't let things go. Like, I'm sorry, but if I wanted to eat some weird, mushy stuff, I'd go be a vegetarian or whatever." My stomach turned. "She's still in bed," he continued, lowering his voice. "Probably sulking. I swear, sometimes it's like dealing with a child. Like, sorry, but I don't need a lecture every time I don't worship the ground she walks on." Something inside me snapped. I threw the covers off and swung my legs over the side of the bed, my entire body tense with anger. I wasn't even thinking anymore. I just needed to see his face when he realized I had heard every word. I stepped into the hallway, and the moment I appeared, Nick turned toward me, his phone still pressed to his ear. His eyes widened slightly, but then he gave me a tight-lipped smile, like he had just been caught doing something mildly embarrassing, not completely trashing me to his mother. Gotta go," he said quickly, hanging up before Karen could respond. He shoved his phone into his pocket and gave me a look like, "What's your problem?" I crossed my arms over my chest, my heart pounding. So that's what you really think of me? Nick groaned, rubbing a hand over his face. Oh my God, Maddie, don't start. Don't start? I repeated, my voice shaking. I just listened to you mock me to your mother like I was some overdramatic child throwing a tantrum. He scoffed. Well, maybe if you didn't act like one, I wouldn't have anything to say. I felt like I had been punched. For a second, I just stood there, staring at him, trying to process how casually cruel he was being, how easily he dismissed me, reduced everything I felt to some kind of irrational overreaction. You know what? I said finally, my voice quieter now, steadier. I used to think you just didn't realize how much you hurt me, but now I see that you do. You just don't care. Nick rolled his eyes. Oh my God, Maddie, stop being so dramatic. It was a joke. A joke? I let out a hollow laugh. You called me emotional for getting upset about you disrespecting me, but you had no problem running to your mommy to complain the second I didn't just let it go? His face hardened. At least my mom actually understands me, unlike you. There it was, the final nail in the coffin. I took a slow breath, feeling something settle inside me, something calm and certain. You know what, Nick? You win. You don't have to deal with my drama anymore. His brows furrowed. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. I just turned and walked back to the bedroom, my mind already made up. This wasn't a fight I wanted to win. This was a war I was done fighting altogether. I shut the bedroom door behind me and stood there, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles ached. My whole body was buzzing with anger, but beneath it, something else was settling in. A deep, unwavering certainty. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't something we'd brush off in a few days, pretend it never happened, let it fade into the background like every other time he made me feel small. This was it. I was done. I turned and looked around the room, taking it in like I was seeing it for the first time. The bed we shared, the dresser with our mismatched clothes crammed inside, the nightstand covered in his things, his wallet, his keys, the half-empty glasses of water he never bothered to take to the sink. My own things felt like they barely existed in this space, pushed to the edges, taking up as little room as possible. Just like me. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with unspoken words, with all the times I had swallowed my feelings just to keep the peace. I thought about the way Nick had looked at me when I confronted him. Like I was an inconvenience, an overreaction, something to be managed rather than understood. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't even seemed surprised that I was upset. It was just another night for him. Another moment where he could twist things, make me feel unreasonable, make me second-guess whether I even had the right to be angry, but I wasn't going to second-guess myself anymore. I sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up my phone. Sarah's message was still open on the screen. Why are you still with him? The words felt like a challenge, a mirror held up to my own excuses. I had spent so long justifying things, telling myself that no relationship was perfect, that everyone had flaws, that maybe I was expecting too much. But Sarah was right. It wasn't about one bad night. It was about all the bad nights, all the quiet disappointments, all the ways he had made me feel like I was asking for too much just by wanting to be treated with basic respect. I took a deep breath and typed my response. I'm not. She answered almost immediately. Holy shit, are you serious? Yeah, late now. I hesitated before responding. Part of me wanted to say yes, to grab my things and walk out the door, to never look back. But it wasn't that simple. I needed a plan. If I left in a rush, Nick would notice. He would try to stop me, talk me into staying, twist my words until I didn't even remember why I was leaving in the first place. That was how it always worked. He pushed, I broke, and then I apologized. Not this time. Not right this second, but soon. There was a long pause before her next message. Good. Do you need help? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to drag Sarah into my mess, but the truth was I did need help. I had never let myself think about what leaving would actually look like. Where would I go? How much of my stuff could I take without him noticing? Would he even care? Or would he just move on like I was nothing? Maybe. I need to figure out a plan first. Sarah's response was immediate. Whatever you need, I've got you. Just say the word. I set my phone down and exhaled. My heart was still racing, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from anxiety. It was from clarity. I was leaving, and I wasn't going to let Nick manipulate me into staying. I stood up and went to the closet, pulling down the duffel bag I had stuffed on the top shelf months ago, back when we had gone on a weekend trip together. It was one of the few times in our relationship when I had felt close to him, when things had felt easy. I had convinced myself that the version of Nick I saw on that trip, the affectionate, funny, engaged version, was the real him, and that everything else, all the coldness, all the dismissiveness, was just temporary. But it wasn't. That version of him was the mask. The indifference was real. I unzipped the bag and sat on the floor, thinking through what I needed. I couldn't take everything, not right away. If he noticed too much missing, he'd get suspicious. I needed to be careful. First, the important documents: passport, birth certificate, bank statements, the things I couldn't replace. I gathered them from the drawer where I kept them and tucked them into the side pocket of the bag. Then clothes, just enough to get by for a while: a few shirts, jeans, underwear, my toiletries, the basics. I hesitated when I reached for my jewelry box. Most of it was cheap, nothing I couldn't leave behind, but there were a few pieces that mattered: gifts from my mother, a necklace my grandmother had passed down to me. I carefully tucked them into a small pouch and placed them inside the bag. I moved quickly, methodically, listening for any sign that Nick might come back to check on me. But he didn't. I could still hear the muffled sounds of the TV from the other room, the occasional rustle of fast food wrappers. He was completely oblivious. I sat back on my heels, looking at the half-packed bag, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. This wasn't just some impulsive decision made in the heat of the moment. This was me choosing myself, choosing my future. Tomorrow, I'd start looking for a new place. Sarah would help, I knew she would, and I had some savings, enough to get by for a little while. I wasn't sure where I'd go yet, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that I was going. I zipped the bag shut and slid it back under the bed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. The rest would come later. I glanced at the nightstand, at the framed photo of Nick and me from 2 years ago. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, looking like the perfect couple. I picked it up, studying it for a moment, then opened the drawer and shoved it inside. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket over me, and stared at the ceiling. Nick was still out there, still watching TV, still living in his own world where I was nothing more than an afterthought. But soon, he'd realize, and soon I'd be gone. The next morning, I woke up before Nick. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I was about to do settle over me. This was it. No more waiting. No more second guessing. I had a plan, and today, I was going to follow through. I slid out of bed carefully, making sure not to wake him. He was still sprawled out on his side, one arm draped over my pillow like he had the night all to himself. His face was relaxed, peaceful, like he had no idea that everything was about to change. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and texted Sarah. "Leaving today." She responded immediately. "I'll be there in an hour." I took a deep breath and moved to the closet, pulling my duffel bag from its hiding spot under the bed. It was already packed with everything I needed: clothes, documents, the few things that mattered to me. I had been careful not to take too much, just enough to start over without raising suspicion. Nick was clueless, as always. He never paid attention to details unless they directly affected him. I grabbed my toiletries from the bathroom, stuffing them into the bag as quietly as possible. Every little noise felt deafening in the silence. I kept glancing toward the bedroom, half expecting him to stir, to roll over and ask what I was doing. But he didn't. When I was finally ready, I stood in the living room, looking around at the space that had been my home for the past 2 years. It didn't feel like home anymore. Maybe it never had. It had always been his place, his rules, his world. I had just existed in it, shrinking myself down piece by piece until I barely recognized who I was. The sound of Nick's alarm cut through the air, making me jump. A few seconds later, I heard him groan and shift in bed. My heart pounded. I didn't want to be here when he woke up. I needed to be gone before he had the chance to talk me into staying. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, taking one last look around before heading for the door, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard his voice. "Maddie?" I froze. He sounded groggy, still half asleep, but I could hear the confusion in his voice. I turned slowly to see him standing in the bedroom doorway, rubbing his eyes. His hair was messy, his t-shirt wrinkled. He looked at me, then at the bag in my hand, and his expression shifted. What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag. "I'm leaving." For a second, he just stared at me like the words didn't make sense. Then he let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Okay, funny. Where are you going?" "I'm serious, Nick." The amusement dropped from his face. "Wait, what?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm leaving, for good." His eyes narrowed, scanning my face like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. When he realized I wasn't laughing, his expression hardened. "This is about last night, isn't it?" he scoffed. "Jesus, Maddie, you're really gonna do this over some stupid dinner?" I felt a rush of anger, but I didn't let it show. I had expected this. Of course he was going to act like I was being irrational, like I was blowing everything out of proportion. That was what he always did. "This isn't about last night," I said, my voice steady. "It's about everything. It's about how you treat me, about how I feel like I don't even exist in this relationship. I'm done, Nick." His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You're being dramatic." "No, I'm finally seeing things clearly." He let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his hair. "Come on, Maddie. Don't do this. You're just upset. We'll talk about it and—" "There's nothing to talk about," I cut in. "I'm leaving." He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, just like that, his whole demeanor changed. He scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Fine, go. If you want to throw away everything over nothing, that's on you." I nodded. "It is." I turned back toward the door, my fingers wrapping around the handle, but before I could pull it open, he spoke again. "You'll regret this." His voice was cold now, edged with something sharp. I didn't turn around. I just opened the door and stepped out. The hallway felt different, lighter, like I had just shed something heavy that had been weighing me down for years. I walked down the stairs, each step steadier than the last, until I reached the front entrance of the building. Sarah was waiting outside, leaning against her car. When she saw me, she straightened, her eyes scanning my face. "You okay?" I nodded, "Yeah." She didn't ask any more questions. She just opened the passenger door and I slid inside. As we pulled away, I glanced out the window at the apartment one last time. Nick wouldn't come after me. I knew that now. He'd sit in that apartment, stewing in his own ego, convincing himself that he had done nothing wrong. But I didn't care anymore, because for the first time in years, I was free. The first night away from Nick felt strange, not because I missed him. I didn't. But because the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from being ignored, dismissed, or made to feel like I was asking for too much. It was peaceful. A kind of quiet I hadn't realized I was missing. I stayed at Sarah's place for a few days while I figured out my next steps. She didn't pressure me to talk, didn't force me to analyze every detail of my decision. She just let me exist, let me breathe. Let me remember what it felt like to be around someone who actually cared about me. She made coffee in the mornings, left blankets on the couch for me at night, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. Nick, on the other hand, had been silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. And honestly, that was worse than any angry message he could have sent, because it confirmed what I already knew. He never really cared about me, not in the way I had cared about him. I had spent so much time twisting myself into something smaller, something easier to love, and the second I stopped, he let me go without a fight. But then on the fourth day, my phone buzzed. I almost didn't look. I had promised myself I wouldn't waste any more energy on him, but curiosity won. I glanced at the screen and saw his name. "Nick, hope you're happy. You threw away a good thing. Don't come crawling back when you realize no one else will put up with you." I stared at the message, feeling nothing. No anger, no sadness, no guilt, just relief, because this was exactly who he was, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to prove him wrong, to explain myself, to make him see my worth. I didn't owe him anything. I blocked his number. That night, I made dinner with Sarah. Nothing fancy, just pasta and garlic bread, something easy and comforting. But for the first time in a long time, I actually enjoyed cooking. There was no pressure, no expectation, no one sitting across from me making me feel like my effort wasn't enough. As I sat at the table twirling pasta around my fork, I thought about the girl I had been 3 years ago, the one who had fallen in love with someone who never really saw her, the one who had slowly shrunk herself down, piece by piece, just to fit into his world. I didn't know her anymore, and I didn't want to. I took another bite of my food, savoring the flavors, and smiled to myself. For the first time in a long time, everything tasted right.